The economic effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine are being felt all over the world, including on American farm fields. Russia and Ukraine produce over a quarter of the world's wheat. With those exports now in peril, some farmers are looking to fill that void. This, in turn, is leading to higher demand for farm equipment. So for more, I want to bring in Bloomberg Commodities reporter Joe Doe. And Joe, I'm kind of understating the situation because you have noticed that there are full-on bidding wars for certain farm equipment, right?
Yeah, that's right. We had a story that really looked at these so-called air seeders, and without getting too far into it, basically an air seeder is what plants wheat. It's the machine that they prefer to put wheat seed into soil. And what we found is there's bidding on used equipment of these air seeders going for $450,000, $615,000. I mean, these are numbers that Machinery Pete, this is a guy named Greg Peterson, who's the go-to.
I love that name.
It's pretty unbelievable, but he's the go-to industry source for used farm equipment. He said, listen, at the end of the year, I thought prices couldn't get any higher for farm equipment. And then the turn of the year, it happened. And now we have Russia invading Ukraine, and it's pretty uncertain as to how high this could really go.
So it went up to as much as $600,000. How much is a new air seeder?
You know, we were looking at new air seeder prices for Deere, right? We figured that was a pretty good benchmark. You're looking at about $350,000, and that's before you put in all the bells and whistles. So obviously, you know, the air seeders, the used air seeders we were looking at are larger ones, and, you know, they're obviously in pretty good shape. But I think that gives you a good sense of where the market is, right? There's severe constraint in getting new equipment. And that just goes back to the supply chain issues that have existed around the globe now for well over a year.
Yeah.
And if farmers are having to wait 1-2 years to get new equipment, but they need something now, that tells you that they're willing to pay quite a premium on used equipment that they can get onto their farms immediately.
And that's really important here, that point that they need to be preparing for what's going to happen a couple months or maybe even a couple years down the road. You cover companies like John Deere, and if you look at the share price, it has climbed to record highs because the war is stoking demand for farm equipment like you've written about. How is the company responding? I mean, is it building more of these air seeders to fill this demand?
So the war obviously started at the end of February, and we haven't had Deere come out and say anything publicly about the direct impacts of the war. What we do know leading up to that is the company has been raising prices every quarter on all of its equipment. And a large part of raising those prices, and it's been going on for a number of quarters now, is to offset the rising material costs that have been going on because of inflation and to offset the shipping and supply chain problems that we've been seeing out there. One of the reasons we also looked at these air seeders for wheat is because American farmers typically go bigger on soybeans and corn plantings. And as you said at the top of this segment, you know, Russia and Ukraine account for a quarter of wheat exports to the globe. So that means somebody's going to have to at least fill in some of the gap that's happened if we don't actually see that same amount of wheat being exported from Ukraine and Russia. And we just have some data out, some private data out, showing that we're actually starting to see an increase in the amount of wheat that American farmers are planting versus what they've done in the past.
So what does that mean that American farmers will plant less of? Because they only have so much room for plantings. If they're going to increase their plantings of wheat, they're giving up on something else, no?
Yeah, I mean, it probably means that they're going to be producing a little bit less corn and a little bit less soybean. Now, listen, we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves because this is such early days. And that, again, is not to say that, you know, suddenly farmers are not going to be producing as much corn and soybean. But it does show that at least some farmers are going out there and saying, you know what, we're going to use part of our crop to focus on wheat. You know, corn and soybean are typically more profitable. And especially if you can get the right soil and the right conditions, it's just a big game. But obviously some people think, especially with wheat prices rising more than 30% since the war started, they can probably get a nice bit of profit by planting a little bit of wheat that they normally wouldn't have done.
Yeah, it definitely works out in their favor. So we keep saying that wheat exports are in peril. There might be a shortage, or there is expected to be a shortage. Have we already seen a dramatic drop-off in the supply of wheat, or is this still something that people are anticipating and they're trying to price in?
I think a bit of it is anticipated. We do know that ships going in and out of the region just aren't doing it anymore, right? So that's the first thing is traders are saying, listen, ships are actually not docking in Russia. There's a lot of ships that just aren't docking in Ukraine. I mean, we know that a number of shipping companies have just rerouted, right? And that, they've sent their ships around to Europe, and then some of the ones that were destined to go for Russia or Ukraine are then being inspected in Europe by EU officials. So I think the market is anticipating that this is actually going on. We should be having more numbers coming out over the next weeks and months as to how big of an impact that is.
Right.
And there's still a question, how much planting are we actually going to see in Ukraine? Will there be a planting season for wheat?
When will we know that?
Well, this spring, obviously, coming up, we'll start seeing numbers or lack of numbers. I mean, there have been some estimates as to how much people are expecting to be planted. But again, it's just really hard to hitch your tractor up to those numbers right now, just because it's a war zone, right?
Yeah.
And it's just so fluid, and it's impossible to know if a farmer who's intending to do a little bit of wheat farming is actually going to have that land 2 weeks from now.
And it's also not a priority given that it is a war zone and we're just trying to make sure that the damage is as contained as can be when it comes to people and their safety. The other thing here when we talk about plantings is the Department of Agriculture is going to be releasing some numbers fairly soon on what spring wheat plantings will look like in the U.S. What are people thinking about in terms of how different this will look than what we've seen in years past?
If we just go off the private data that's out there right now, we do think that they're going to show an increased amount of wheat. How much of an increase, I think, is really why people are waiting to see what the government comes out and says at the end of March.
Okay, got it. So we'll continue to look ahead to things like that. Joe Do, thank you so much. Bloomberg Commodities reporter Joe Do on how these air seeders are becoming really expensive. Used air seeders listed at $600,000.